It's Depeche Mode, the podcast, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. Glad you are with another episode as we talk about the greatest band on the face of the planet. At least according to you and me. Wrapping up what is really Depeche Mode month when you consider the number of anniversaries celebrated in the month of March, considering the many releases from the band that have taken place over the course of decades in March. It really is Depeche Mode month. I hadn't really even considered that until seeing it online earlier this week. Of course, last week we talked about the 35th anniversary of Violator, and we're going to mark the end of Depeche Mode month by looking back 2 years on the release of Memento Mori and the start of that incredible tour, and really the era of Memento Mori, which for the time being has wrapped up as we patiently await the Mexico documentary, the physical release of the Memento Mori tour, and those 4 unreleased, fully produced Memento Mori tracks. The band is quiet as ever since the end of the tour, so we patiently await announcements of those releases. I heard this comment made attached to something else, and quite honestly, I can't remember what it was, but I thought it incredibly apropos for Depeche Mode and Depeche Mode fans, and that's why I titled this week's episode, "You Don't Choose Depeche Mode, Depeche Mode Chooses You." And I think that speaks volumes, and I'll only speak for me, but that speaks volumes to this relationship that has carried on all these decades with this amazing band, going back to the first time that I discovered Depeche Mode, having heard a few songs, Just Can't Get Enough, People Are People, but then really having the band reach out and grab me upon hearing Shake the Disease for the first time. And that, for me, was the moment that Depeche Mode chose me to be a fan, of which I have been now in those decades since then. And so I titled this week's podcast that very thing. You don't choose Depeche Mode, Depeche Mode chooses you. We have some listener emails, feedback to get to this week. But as we look back on the 2 years since Memento Mori, I'll add a few of my thoughts. And then what I found here is a review done by Brian Hazard. Now, the name might mean something to many of you listening to the show. Perhaps if I said color theory, that would go and mean something further for those Depeche Mode fans that are aware of the band Color Theory and its love of Depeche Mode. What I found here was an interview. I'm sorry, not an interview, but a review going back to March of 2023 of Memento Mori by Brian Hazard of Color Theory. It's a really interesting review, so I thought in honor of the 2-year anniversary of Memento Mori, I would go through and share with you Brian Hazard's thoughts on the album and add in my own, and then we'll dive into some listener feedback this week. Before I do, as always, if you want to email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, and if you're enjoying this up on YouTube, of course, go ahead and leave a comment there as well, and we'll get to those listener feedbacks coming up after this review from Brian Hazard. But I've spent some time listening to the entirety of Memento Mori over the course of the past week in preparation of the show this week. One thing that I have not attributed to this album, and maybe it's only because I've now sort of recognized this in my love for Memento Mori, is there really is something rather timeless about this record. I won't go through all the thoughts that I shared upon its release. Surprisingly, though, the thoughts that I had on the album ring true 2 years later on. I can't say that for many of the other Depeche Mode releases, and more specifically probably Spirit. I had much higher praise for Spirit upon its initial release than I did in the years that came following Spirit. The album just didn't stick with me and didn't have the longevity, and I didn't have the enthusiasm for it like I did upon first hearing it. Memento Mori is completely different, though. I listened to the album in its entirety on the drive home from work today. It's sort of a combination of walking around the office and listening to it in the car, and enjoyed it just as much today as I did going back 2 years ago. It may not have the abundance of singles and hits, say, that A Violator does by any stretch, or Songs of Faith and Devotion, or, even Ultra for that matter. But there is something really, truly special about this record, and there's a timeless quality to it. Portions of the album that harken back to previous Depeche Mode songs from various stages of their career, while, again, wholly crafting something new. It's just a solid album from beginning to end that I still enjoy. It's kind of more of an experience, a different listening experience than what you get on other Depeche Mode records, and certainly those records that we look back on so fondly around the sort of apex moment from the band. Your Black Celebration, Some Great Reward, Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion, and Ultra. That being said, Memento Mori for me does set itself apart as the best album since Ultra, and as I've said before, going all the way back to Songs of Faith and Devotion, while being a much different listening experience than those other albums. I'd love to hear from you and get your thoughts, and maybe on next week's episode as we head into a new month, I can share sort of your 2 years on version of how you feel and review of Memento Mori. So get those comments up on YouTube and send those emails in to talkshownerd@gmail.com. All right, let's dive into what Brian Hazard has to say. He has a really interesting approach to his review. He reviews the album, and then he goes track by track. I've trimmed it down as best I could for just the sake of time in the podcast this week. But going back to, again, March 8th of 2023, Brian writes, and then there were two. I'm both pleasantly surprised and deeply grateful that my all-time favorite band graced us with their 15th studio album. I don't expect another, but I'd love to be proven wrong. Memento Mori may not be revolutionary, but it serves as a fitting homage to their previous work and a culmination of their post-Allen sound. It's as if the production team listed all the ingredients of the best Depeche Mode albums for one last trip down memory lane, peppered with Easter eggs and fan service. I've never read this review before, by the way, but I found it interesting that Brian Hazard picked up on something that I picked up on, and many of you picked up on as well. And that is sort of these subtle nods going back to previous Depeche Mode albums that I would love to be able to pick the brain of Dave and Martin to find out how intentional that was or wasn't. I imagine that after they nailed down the sonic recipe, they wrote down the song titles of their biggest hits on pieces of paper, cut out individual words, threw them in a bag, and pulled them out to resemble new song titles like People Are Good, Never Let Me Go, hoping some of that mojo might rub off. The result is familiar, comfortable, and purposely flawed like torn denim. It sounds like Depeche Mode and no one else. You have to give them credit. They're not resting on their laurels while their contemporaries are playing county fairs and the 80s and nostalgia cruises. They're still relevant in their 60s. I'm going to go out on a limb and say Memento Mori steals the title of Best Produced DM Album from Ultra. Though you may disagree with me on both accounts, the songs are simple, but the sound is anything but. Every synth lead has multiple layers spread across the soundstage. Even the simplest hi-hat sample has depth and dimension. Let me add in here, too, just the production value on the album alone is spectacular. This album is one of the few that I can crank all the way almost up to max inside of my car, and it never breathes a hint of distortion in terms of losing the quality and the details within each and every track. Getting back to Brian's words here, the vocal performance and production are flawless, as I mentioned. Starting with Exciter, I've heard obvious pitch correction blunders on every record until now. Martin's vibrato is comfortably and tastefully restrained, and Dave's voice is at max richness throughout. Dave's lyrics still may lack vivid imagery, but for the first time, they're melodically and harmonically on par with the rest of the album. Best of all, the blues guitar I complained about in my Delta Machine review and the politics of spirit are blissfully absent. So why is Memento Mori such a chore to listen to? Don't get me wrong, says Brian. I've come to enjoy it and consider it their best since playing The Angel. While I've listened through it at least a dozen times, I never find myself hungering for another playthrough. I've given it a lot of thought, and I think it comes down to the vocal melodies. They tend to follow a stepwise motion and often linger on the root and minor third of the scale. Rhythmically, they're composed of mostly eighth and quarter notes. To put it simply, the vocal melodies lack hooks. If their aim was to craft a set of songs that they could sing on tour well into their 70s, they succeeded. The notes sit comfortably in the middle of their vocal ranges and rarely extend beyond an octave. When I think back to Depeche Mode melodies that captivated me the most over the years, they usually include leaps, syncopated rhythms, or both. Case in point, you know how hard it is for me from Shake the Disease, with its sense of slowing down into that precarious leap upwards, or the magnificent leapfrogging melody of Question of Lust. Or, while we're on question songs, the zigzagging offbeat, it won't be long before you'll do exactly what they want you to of Question of Time. It's not just about the vocal acrobatics, though. The hook can be just a note or two, like the syncopated It's a Competitive World of Everything Counts, or the rapid-fire 16th notes, All I Ever Wanted, All I Ever Needed of Enjoy the Silence. The common denominator is surprise, which is in short supply on Memento Mori. It's also pleasantly predictable. One exception is the pre-chorus of Ghosts Again, with its behind-the-beat syncopation that demands multiple listens to sing along confidently with. Perhaps that's why it was chosen as the lead single. Now that I've set forward a thesis, I'd like to talk a little bit about each track in sequence. I worked out the chords, time signatures, and beats permitted in case you'd like to record a cover version or sing along at home. I did my I did my best to present them in the simplest way possible, which is entirely consistent from song to song. So I took out some of the detailed in terms of the chords and time signatures and all that. It doesn't really work for the podcast, and simply stuck to the review portion of Brian Hazard's comments of each track, starting off with with My Cosmos Is Mine. At first, this one struck me as an odd opener and an even odder single, but over time the rationale became clear. Let me stop here for just a second. It was interesting as I was listening to the album on the drive home today. It struck me that Never Let Me Go would have been a really interesting opener for the album. And I almost think that you could have moved, say, Speak to Me to another portion of the album and ended on My Cosmos Is Mine. Just a thought, but as I was listening to Never Let Me Go, I just thought, man, you know what? If they had opened the album with this track, that would have been a really interesting move. And it might have even lent itself a little bit more positivity to a track that sounds very typically or stereotypically Depeche Mode, in my opinion. Let's get back into My Cosmos Is Mine. Brian Hazard writes, the band opens the album quite literally declaring ownership of their sonic universe. The Seinfeldian masters of their domain. Nice one. Sure, it sounds like a funeral dirge, but it's a production tour de force and a skilled bit of world building. The blues guitar is gone, but the essence of blues lives on in their chord progressions and melodies. The melodic contour here is evocative of Gershwin's It Ain't Necessarily So from Porgy and Bess, which contains one of my all-time favorite rhymes. He made his home in that fish's abdomen. As for the single release, my guess is that it was intended as an album teaser more than a dedicated single. I tend to agree. The bridge chords are the only ones on the album I'm not 100% confident in, because it isn't much harmonic information there to work with. Moving on to Wagging Tongue, on paper, this one ticks all the boxes. We've got our usual cast of saints and sinners, themes of defiance and redemption, and a somewhat shocking central image of an angel's death. What it all means is anyone's guess, but when the bass drops in the second verse, I'm here for it. The blues gospel influence is present lyrically and also harmonically. Most notably in the chorus is the dominant seventh chord. The synth lead is an instrumental break at 154, reminds me of another DM track, but I can't quite put my finger on it. It's cool to see Dave and Martin writing a song together, but I get the sense that we're left only what both found acceptable, kind of like the last Tears for Fears record. Ghosts Again, I was taken in by this one, so much so that I recorded my own cover version within 12 hours of the original going live on YouTube. Ghosts Again already feels like a classic. So much has already been said that I don't have much to add beyond two short points. Sonically, this owes a lot to Playing the Angel and Precious in particular, minus a touch of grit. Harmonically, the track never resolves. We never actually land on an A major chord, a metaphor for immortality. And let me say this with regard to Ghosts Again. I've mentioned this song a lot. It's my favorite song off of Memento Mori by a long shot. Personally, I find the song as compelling and interesting and enjoyable as Enjoy the Silence. And quite honestly, I feel like it's their strongest single next to Enjoy the Silence. And I know that's a stretch, but that's just my opinion of it. I can't help but wonder, because that song is so strong, that just given the history of the band and the choice of songs for the album, why there aren't more songs that are so easily accessible, like Ghosts Again, on the record. I mean, Martin is certainly capable of writing tracks like that. And adding to the list of songs that I would personally go, and this is my commentary, obviously, not Brian Hazard's from Color Theory, but adding to the list of questions I'd love to ask the band, I wonder if it's a conscious choice to not include hit songs like that anymore, to do something different, to evolve a bit. Because I feel like Martin could write a slew of Ghosts Again level quality songs. Now, he had the help, songwriting-wise, of Richard Butler. And by the way, have we come to a consensus on whether or not we like the Richard Butler tracks? I know that I do. I'd be interested to see what contributions he could make on another Depeche Mode album. But I just wonder, with the band on for as long as they have been, creating 15 different albums, if they actually choose to do tracks that are less accessible for Memento Mori, which also has me questioning whether or not those 4 unreleased tracks that eventually we're going to get, how accessible are those songs? I think my theory may actually ring true if we find out that those 4 tracks are more of the pedestrian, for lack of a better word, Depeche Mode songs. Easily approachable, more akin to singles. I know that may seem contrary. You want to put the best stuff on the album. I just wonder if Dave and Martin now would like to put on more interesting tracks on an album rather than ones that you would typically go and say, that's a Depeche Mode song, like a Ghosts Again. I could be way off the mark in my assessment, by the way. That song is so quintessentially Depeche Mode to me that I wonder if there are other tracks, and those 4 other tracks are also along those lines, and Dave and Martin just didn't want to put them on the album because they didn't want to have something, many tracks on the album that were reflective of things that were done and songs that were done in the past. All right, I've said my rant. Let's move on. Moving over to Don't Say You Love Me, my second favorite song, by the way, personally, off Memento Mori. Brian Hazard writes this. This one uses a classic songwriting technique called the laundry list. For example, Alanis Morissette's Ironic. It's like rain on your wedding day. It's like a free ride you've already paid. It's the good advice that you just didn't take. The formula is simple. It's like X, it's like Y, it's like Z. Now you just fill in the items on the list Mad Lib style, and voila, you're a songwriter. It's another example would be Sting's If I Ever Lose My Faith in You, which follows this pattern. You could say I lost my X, you could say I lost my Y, you could say I lost my Z. Or more recently, Death Cab for Cuties, I'll Never Give Up on You, which in my opinion is a blatant ripoff of the aforementioned Sting song. Here we've got You'll Be the X, I'll Be the Y. The structure works well to deliver a chilling tale of dysfunction and emotionally manipulative relationship. The lyrics are rich with vivid imagery and culminate in a zinger of the last line. My apologies for the word salad, by the way. When I record the podcast, I'm coming off of doing my radio show. So, depending on how busy or how tired I am after doing the weekly radio show, and today's show was oddly a very, very busy show today. I'm a little bit on the tongue-tied side, so my apologies if my commentary is lacking in its smoothness on this week's episode, to which you weekly listeners are probably going, John, you sound like this every week, which you're probably not wrong. Moving on to My Favorite Stranger. I don't know if this one is actually about dissociative identity disorder, but I think of it as the Moon Knight song. The narrator has a destructive alter ego that is slowly taking over his life. The sound design is dark and ominous, creating a sense of unease with cinematic strings and octave leaping squeaks. I'm confused as to why the alter ego would be the narrator's favorite stranger, when he obviously disapproves, but I'm probably just being overly analytical. In case it wasn't obvious, I haven't scoured the internet for interviews or message board discussions about the intended meanings of the songs. I have no special insight or authority, says Brian. This song contains one of the Easter eggs I mentioned before. When Martin echoes the word hands on a high A-B at 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Again, I can't quite pin it down, but I'm pretty sure we heard it on Violator. Soul With Me, when I had the idea to transcribe the chords for the whole album, I worried this song might stop me dead in my tracks. I was pleasantly surprised to find that it's actually quite straightforward and elegant. Like with previous Martin ballads, such as Home and One Caress, the chords shift dramatically to accommodate a repeated melodic contour. Lyrically, it's an outright celebration of death, with the chords reflecting each step of the journey. We start with a minor chord representing the world's disasters. We weave our way through different forms to ultimately arrive at a heavenly relative major. I'd appreciate the song more if the chorus wasn't yanked from a hymnal, but I get what he's going for. This is one of the best songs on the album, and it's a shame that Martin didn't get a second feature. I was thinking that exact same thing listening to the album on the drive home today, by the way. Caroline's Monkey, Brian says, this one's a head-scratcher. Why are the lyrics in the third person? Why a female? We never get any clues as to what the narrator's relationship is with the subject. Since this is co-written by the Psychedelic Furs frontman Richard Butler, I wonder if the song refers to the same Caroline who was so pretty in pink back in 1986. 40 years later, she's a drug addict. The phrase forgiveness and everything in the second verse sounds a lot like The Cure's With Babies and Everything, absolutely, from Disintegration, the song, not the album. There's no satisfaction on Caroline's Train strikes me as a lazy rhyme. I think brain makes more sense in the context of addiction. That's an interesting note. Before We Drown. After my first listen through the album, this was my favorite song, and the one I chose to add to my vocal synthwave retrowave playlist on Spotify. I didn't immediately recognize it as one of Dave's, but over time, as I familiarized myself with the colorless lyrics, there was no mistaking it. This has to be the weakest verse on the record. I feel so naked standing on the shore. Are you sure? Nothing's out there. Nothing else. No more. No more. I tend to agree with Brian there. Are you sure is completely superfluous. And nothing else. No more. No more is doubly redundant. Even the central image of drowning makes no sense in context. First we stand up, then we fall down. Establishes that we were standing on the ground or possibly the shore based on the verse I just cited. Then we have to move forward before we drown. Presumably, if you move forward from the shore, you will drown. Fortunately, it works better in context than on paper thanks to Dave's excellent vocal delivery. The stellar production features some cool Martin vocal echoes that we've heard somewhere before. People are good. This one goes down as my actual favorite. Melodically, it doesn't have much going for it, alternating between the root and minor third of the scale, but the lyrics more than make up for it. Have you heard the acronym API? It stands for Assume Positive Intent. And it's a useful rule of thumb when dealing with people online. Text and emojis can be ambiguous. So the idea is to give others the benefit of the doubt and interpret their words in the most favorable way possible. My wife does this when I'm driving, much to my chagrin. I'll point out some idiot who's going 20 miles per hour in a 50 who's going 20 miles per hour in a 50 mile per hour zone, and she'll say, he's probably just lost. Okay, sure, and maybe he's an idiot. I make a habit out of assuming positive intent while suspecting I'm being mocked, so I very much relate to this song. Always You. You're probably familiar with the peak end rule, which suggests that for any given experience, we're prone to remember the most intense moments and the ending. It applies to an album sequencing, which is why it's important to end with a strong track. Of course, you want to start with your best stuff. That leaves the area near the end for the weakest material. I don't want to be overly negative, so I'll just say that I think the album is well sequenced. I don't consider this song to be a laundry list, but once you strip away all the repetition, there aren't many words left. One thing's for sure, the second verse should have been cut in half. It really bogs down the momentum, and the track is already plenty long at 4 minutes and 18 seconds. Never Let Me Go. This one could have been called A Question of Time Part 2. It's got a similar style and sound, with the exception of the guitars that remind me of The Cure's Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. I rank this one above Always You, but there's nothing particularly distinctive about it. It's what ChatGPT might come up with when asked to write a Depeche Mode song. Speak to Me. We close with a Dave song, which means the colorless lyrics. Should have used ChatGPT. It's funny. The only visual image is lying on the bathroom floor. I assume it's a plea to God amidst the throes of addiction, but maybe I'm reading too much into Dave's personal history. The song itself is just 3 verses, but the production, the arrangement, or should I say the orchestration, is truly magnificent. Like many Depeche Mode closers, this one explores new sonic territory. I'm not sure who we have to thank for this auditory delight, but they've outdone themselves. The final words, I'm here now, I'm found, we are redeemed. Not a bad place for Depeche Mode's legacy to close. Did you really just read that whole thing? You must be a serious Depeche Mode fan, writes Brian Hazard. Some fans seem to believe the band can do no wrong. If you're one of them, I've managed to offend you. Please assume assume positive intent. I'm just one flawed and biased individual calling it as I see it. Thanks for reading. Love, Brian. So, to the Speak to Me aspect of it, and I'm sure Brian knows this now, the fact that Dave handed that track over to James Ford and Marta Salogni to create the actual instrumentation and the music for the song, I think is exactly what Brian was speaking towards. And I think you can hand that production over probably more so to Marta, considering that we know James Ford's production work on Spirit, which was solid. But there's a depth and a richness to Memento Mori that, quite honestly, we really hadn't seen since, in my opinion, since Alan left the band, and which is why I've mentioned on previous episodes that I'd love to see that production team work with Dave and Martin again on another record, especially given how successful this record was and how specific it was in terms of its darkness. And so you take the central theme of death around Memento Mori, but then you think about what came before it with Delta Machine, its blues-inspired instrumentation, lyrical content, especially how far it deviated from the actual demos, certainly the political nature of Spirit. And then you have this album focusing on the darker side of life and death. Another Depeche Mode album keeping with the theme of Dave and Martin and their desire to do something new each record. I think we could really end up getting something special in as much as those other themes have been covered in the most previous records. I'd imagine that another Depeche album, especially with this production team, that is praying that James Ford is able to overcome his current illness, could bring a rather vibrant and exciting Depeche Mode record in the future. As always, what do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com or leave a comment up on YouTube. All right, let's get into your listener feedback this week. First off, we'll start with S12606JJ, who simply writes this. There are some rumors in the DM groups about 2026. So, obviously, assuming those rumors have to do with the potential of Depeche Mode's future, I asked whether or not they could expand upon that, and as I do every week, I scour the internet looking for rumors and any new news, and I have not heard anything about 2026. I've only heard what I've been able to share with you, and specifically relating to delays of the Mexico documentary, the 4 unreleased tracks, and I'll toss in a potential live album. As far as the future of the band, I would be hard-pressed to believe that anybody would have information the band would be getting back together in 2026, but you never know. I do think that come a couple months from now, when Dave and Martin get together for the Hollywood Walk of Fame, is probably the best opportunity for Dave and Martin to figure out what they want to do in terms of looking at the future. But interesting comment nonetheless. All right, let's go here. Stephanie from the Baltic Coast writes this. Thanks, as always, for your podcast. The last one was special for me. After listening to it, I texted a friend. I was in a church service. I really listened to you devoutly, and it was good to hear your love and passion for Depeche Mode and Violator. I'm so glad to be a part of the club, too. It has explained a lot in my life. I'm sure you will have a lot of fun with the book Depeche Mode Live. I've met both authors, and they're great guys with the same passion as us. Did you know that there will be a special Depeche Mode cruise in May? No, I did not. It starts in Hamburg. Unfortunately, the cover band Forced to Mode puts me off a bit, and I'm afraid I'm not strong enough to drink. That's it from me. Keep up the good work. Your podcast is always a highlight of the week when I commute to work on Fridays and I'm brushing up on my English skills. Oh my gosh, if I'm the source of brushing up on your English skills, then I greatly apologize. All the best from the Baltic Coast. I hope you and your loved ones are doing well. They are, Stephanie. Thank you so much for your kind words. I greatly appreciate it. All right, Allie Joffrey writes this. Hello again from the beautiful island of Madeira. Got it right this time. Fun fact, Madeira wine was famously used to toast the U.S. Declaration of Independence on July 4th of 1776. I was not aware of that. As Violator just marked its 35th anniversary, and as I hit the 1-year mark since seeing Depeche Mode live for the first time in Lisbon on March 19th, I found myself revisiting the album. Then Blue Dress came on, and once again I started thinking about Martin Gore's fashion choices. What if Blue Dress is about Martin's own gender and sexual nonconformity? We already know he pushed against traditional gender norms, especially in the 1990s, frequently wearing skirts, dresses, and other traditionally feminine clothing. He's even spoken about his attraction to effeminate clothes and how he enjoys disorienting people with his style. And then there's the color itself, blue. Not pink, not red, but blue. If it were a pink dress, it might lean more into conventional femininity. But blue dress sits in that ambiguous space between masculine and feminine, making it an even more fitting metaphor for fluidity and nonconformity. Too much of a stress? What do you think? No. Listen, I think what you mentioned here is also another example of the brilliance of the ambiguity of the band, and even within their own personal, stylings, for lack of a better way to describe it. Sometimes, only sometimes, I question everything. Ali Joffrey. Thank you, Ali. And thank you for giving me a proper pronunciation of Madeira. I appreciate it, since I got that wrong for 2 weeks in a row. All right, Dave Hudson writes this. Here's a potential topic, or perhaps just food for thought. The band must feel like there are certain non-negotiable songs that have to be in every show. However, other legendary acts and performers, The Cure, for example, have felt the freedom to play anything they choose. And while we might be disappointed in not hearing a particular song, it doesn't seem to negatively affect the demand or attendance of their shows. It can also be exciting in that you never know what they're going to perform. What are your thoughts? Thanks, Dave Hudson. I imagine that because of the production value that the band puts on every single show, and how detailed it is, lining up with the visuals, the light show, the opportunity to deviate from that would be very difficult apart from Martin Gore and his solos, which they, change. And even then they're limited. I think Martin could probably do more, but I think they like to sort of keep with the central theme for the set list for that tour. So I can't imagine the band doing that simply because of the technical aspects of what it takes to put on a fully produced Depeche Mode show. But it is interesting food for thought. And lastly, we hear from Leah Raffay, who says, enjoying the pod, of course. Thanks for doing it for us. No, thank you guys for listening, even when I stumble over my words. I have a trivia question that maybe you can answer. You'd be the only person outside of the band, I think, that might know. Oh, that's not true. On the album version of Strangelove, who played bass guitar? It wasn't Andy, apparently. I'm told the musician wasn't credited on the album. I hope you can find out through your many magical sources. Looking forward to hearing back from you. Take care and mode on. Have a great day. From Leia, Niagara Falls, Canada. So I did some digging, and unfortunately, I couldn't find an answer for you. I did find that it would, traditionally, when asked who plays bass for the band, it's Fletcher. I think you're correct in whoever played bass on the track was uncredited. My first guess would have been that it was programmed and not done live, but I could be wrong. That being said, there are individuals that are much more knowledgeable than I am relating to the production of Depeche Mode's albums, and I'm sure that if somebody knows the answer to your question, they will be more than happy to share it with me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or if you're knowledgeable on YouTube, leave a comment there. All right, before I let you go, as always, thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I appreciate it. If it's your first time here, I encourage you to go back and listen to the many other Depeche Mode, the podcast, that are available. Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube, and certainly subscribe to whatever podcast platform that you're enjoying Depeche Mode, the podcast on. Also, if you want to support the podcast, you love Depeche Mode, but do you also enjoy reading or listening to science fiction? Well, if you do, I hope you'll treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. I've written a science fiction space opera series. I'm a massive sci-fi fan, a huge fan of Star Wars, of which I also do a weekly podcast. My series is set in the future, where air and space flight culture has replaced car culture. Inspired in part by Depeche Mode, life in the so-called space age, the world we live in, and life in general, Depeche Mode plays a large part in the underlying themes of the story. The main character himself is a massive Depeche Mode fan at a time in the future when the music of the 80s through the aughts, through the 2000s, is nostalgic and popular among the characters of the story. It also features references to Depeche Mode, both direct and indirect, while telling an exciting space opera adventure saga. As Earth faces its end, you'll follow pilots Taft, Katha, and their ragtag crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. Don't miss out on this fast-paced, action-packed, epic science fiction adventure without an agenda. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. If you like your science fiction to be epic, with some romance, filled with unique action sequences and cool technology, EMBARK is perfect for you. 7 books in all in the series, written for adults but great for ages 11 plus. Available in ebook, Kindle Unlimited, hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. All 7 books in the series. Head on over to Amazon.com and simply search for EMBARK, E-M-B-A-R-K, and Jon, Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. I'll be back again next week. Until then, I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you then. Bye.
Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
Depeche Mode, the podcast.